On June 8, 2012, Honolulu, Hawaii, was basking in its typical early summer calm. The waves rolled gently toward Waikiki Beach, palm trees swayed lazily in the breeze, and the streets were filled with newlyweds, families, and tourists eager to soak in the island paradise. Among the visitors arriving that week were a young couple from California, Mark Reynolds, a 32-year-old financial consultant from Sacramento, and his wife, Stephanie Reynolds, a 29-year-old aspiring photographer. Their arrival at Daniel K. Inouye International Airport was nothing unusual. They were just another couple stepping into the postcard-perfect setting of the Hawaiian Islands, ready to celebrate the beginning of their married life. Mark and Stephanie had been married only a week earlier, on June 1, 2012, in a modest but tasteful ceremony in Napa Valley. Friends and relatives described the wedding as intimate and joyful. Mark, known for his methodical nature and sharp mind, had always been seen as a man who valued stability and order. Stephanie, on the other hand, was remembered by her friends as creative, warm, and slightly mysterious. The pairing of the two seemed curious to some, but to others, it was a testament to how opposites could complement each other. The Reynolds couple had chosen Hawaii for their honeymoon because Stephanie had always dreamed of capturing the golden sunsets and lush landscapes through her camera lens. For Mark, the destination held a more practical appeal. Hawaii was close enough to California to avoid an exhausting flight but still exotic enough to feel like an escape from the mainland. Their itinerary included hikes in Oahu's valleys, romantic dinners by the shoreline, and quiet mornings on hotel balconies overlooking the Pacific. But beneath the surface of their new marriage lay a complexity that few, if any, of their friends and family fully understood. Stephanie had carried with her a secret throughout her adult life, a secret about her past identity as a transgender woman. While she had transitioned years earlier and lived openly as female in her social and professional circles, she had not disclosed her history to Mark before their marriage. Whether out of fear, shame, or the hope that her past would remain her own, Stephanie had chosen silence. Mark, for his part, had entered the marriage believing he was starting a straightforward chapter of life with the woman he loved. Friends recalled him as pragmatic but also somewhat conservative in his views. He came from a middle-class family that valued traditional structures, and he often expressed a desire for a normal life, marriage, children, and a comfortable home. In his mind, his marriage to Stephanie was the foundation of that dream. The honeymoon period, both literally and figuratively, became the stage on which hidden truths would collide with rigid expectations. The pressures of beginning married life, coupled with the intimacy and isolation of a Hawaiian honeymoon, made it nearly impossible for Stephanie to continue holding back the truth. What had been manageable in day-to-day dating suddenly became overwhelming under the microscope of marriage. She had crossed the threshold into a life that demanded full honesty, yet the fear of rejection loomed large. Hawaii itself provided a haunting contrast to what was unfolding. The island, so full of natural beauty and marketed as a lover's paradise, stood as a backdrop to a storm quietly building within the couple's hotel room. The cheerful lays, the taste of fresh pineapple, the long walks along Waikiki's shoreline, all of it masked the tension growing between Mark and Stephanie. Their photographs from those first days still showed smiles and closeness, but the reality, as later pieced together by investigators and journalists, was far more fragile. By June 10th, just 2 days into their honeymoon, neighbors at their hotel would later recall hearing muffled arguments from the Reynolds room. At the time, no one thought much of it. Honeymoon couples fought occasionally, especially when adjusting to new routines. Yet those arguments were not about trivial matters like where to eat dinner or how to spend the day. They were arguments orbiting around the secret Stephanie had carried with her and the moment when she would finally tell Mark the truth. What no one could have predicted was how that confession would set in motion a chain of events that turned what should have been a story of love and beginnings into a case study of rage, betrayal, and violence. The murder of Stephanie Reynolds in a Honolulu hotel room shocked not only those who knew the couple but also the wider public, drawing attention to questions of gender identity, disclosure, and the dangerous consequences of secrecy within intimate relationships. As with many tragedies, the story of Mark and Stephanie began not with the crime itself but with the layers of history, choices, and unspoken truths that led up to it. Their honeymoon in Hawaii was meant to symbolize a fresh start. Instead, it became the site of an irreversible end. The days leading up to the tragedy appeared, on the surface, to be nothing more than the joyful rhythm of a honeymoon in paradise. On June 9, 2012, Mark and Stephanie Reynolds checked into the Royal Islander Hotel, a mid-range resort located a few blocks from Waikiki Beach. The hotel catered mostly to vacationers from the mainland United States, and their arrival blended seamlessly into the steady flow of newlyweds and tourists. The staff at the front desk remembered them as polite and cheerful. Stephanie smiled widely while taking photos in the lobby, and Mark handled the check-in paperwork with the calm efficiency of a man used to managing details. The couple's room, located on the 8th floor, overlooked the ocean. From their balcony, they could see surfers riding the waves and the golden glow of sunset fading into the Pacific. It was, by all appearances, an idyllic setting for two people celebrating the beginning of their marriage. Yet, as later investigations revealed, the outward beauty of their surroundings only concealed the quiet strain building between them. Friends back in California were receiving updates from Stephanie through short text messages and photos she posted online. She uploaded images of tropical cocktails, the beach at sunrise, and selfies with Mark, often captioned with affectionate notes like "honeymoon bliss" or "living our dream." To her circle, it seemed like she was living the perfect moment she had always longed for. But behind those carefully chosen snapshots was a storm Stephanie knew she could not avoid forever. For Stephanie, Hawaii was not just a dream destination. It was also the place she had chosen to finally be honest. She had spent years building a life where her past as a transgender woman remained undisclosed to certain people, particularly those she feared might react with anger or rejection. Entering into marriage with Mark had forced her into an emotional corner. She had committed to him in front of family and friends, promising a future together, while knowing that part of her identity remained hidden. Mark, meanwhile, was seen as the picture of stability by those who knew him. He had worked his way up in the finance industry, saving carefully and presenting himself as a man who valued responsibility. He had spoken to colleagues about wanting to settle down, buy a home, and start a family. To him, Stephanie represented that missing piece, a partner who seemed supportive, creative, and eager to share in the life he envisioned. He was not known to be impulsive, nor was he known for violence. Those who later heard of the crime struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the act he committed. As June 9th and 10th unfolded, hotel staff noticed little out of the ordinary. The couple ate breakfast at the hotel's restaurant, strolled along the beach, and rented a car to drive along the island's scenic routes. One staff member recalled Mark asking for directions to Diamond Head State Monument, where the two later spent the afternoon hiking. Photographs taken on the trail by Stephanie showed her beaming at the camera, with Mark in the background, his arm around her shoulders. But other small signs suggested a different story. Guests staying in nearby rooms later reported hearing raised voices on the evening of June 10th. The arguments were described as muffled but persistent, lasting late into the night. One guest even mentioned hearing what sounded like crying, though at the time it was dismissed as the kind of emotional outburst couples sometimes have during stressful travel. What none of those witnesses knew was that Stephanie had finally decided to disclose her past to Mark. The exact details of how she revealed the truth remain unclear, but investigators later pieced together from text messages and diary entries that she had been preparing herself for the conversation for weeks. She understood the risks but believed honesty was necessary for the marriage to move forward. Her friends had encouraged her to tell him before the wedding, but Stephanie had delayed, convincing herself that timing would never be perfect and that love would ultimately outweigh shock. For Mark, the revelation shattered the framework of the life he thought he was building. Accounts from those who knew him suggested that he valued certainty, tradition, and predictability. Learning that his new wife had once lived as a man collided violently with his worldview. In the quiet of their hotel room, surrounded by the scent of hibiscus flowers and the distant sound of ocean waves, Mark's dream of a conventional future began to unravel. The atmosphere in the Reynolds hotel room grew heavier as the hours passed. Stephanie reportedly tried to explain her journey, her transition, and the reason she had waited so long to tell him. Her intent was to show that she was still the same woman he had fallen in love with, that nothing about her present self was a lie. But for Mark, it was not just about the past, it was about trust. He felt deceived, humiliated, and betrayed. This was the emotional foundation upon which the tragedy would later unfold. The honeymoon trip that had begun with romantic photos and celebratory cocktails had shifted into a tense standoff between love and anger, truth and secrecy. By the night of June 10th, the seeds of violence had already been planted, and the paradise around them would soon bear witness to a crime that shocked everyone who thought they knew the couple. The defining moment of the Reynolds honeymoon, and ultimately their lives, occurred on the night of June 10, 2012, inside room 814 of the Royal Islander Hotel in Honolulu. Up until then, their vacation had carried the appearance of normalcy, sightseeing, dining, and the occasional lover's quarrel. But that evening, the long-hidden truth came into full light, and what began as a conversation quickly escalated into confrontation, setting the stage for tragedy. The couple had returned from a day trip to Diamond Head. The hike had been strenuous but rewarding, with panoramic views of Oahu stretching into the horizon. Photos later retrieved from Stephanie's camera showed her smiling in the afternoon sun, Mark's expression slightly subdued, though nothing outwardly alarming. After returning to their hotel, they had dinner at a nearby restaurant, sharing seafood and cocktails before walking back hand in hand. To passers-by, they seemed no different from the dozens of honeymoon couples dotting the Waikiki Strip. Back in their room, however, the air grew tense. According to later forensic reports and witness testimony about sounds overheard, the couple engaged in a heated conversation that stretched for hours. Stephanie, who had been carrying the weight of her undisclosed past, decided that night was the moment to reveal everything. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the setting, or the mounting pressure of her conscience, but she could no longer postpone the truth. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Stephanie told Mark that she had been born male and had transitioned years earlier, before they had met. She explained that she had legally changed her documents, undergone medical treatment, and lived fully as a woman ever since. To her, this disclosure was not meant to end their relationship but to bring it onto firmer ground. She emphasized her love for him, her desire for their marriage to be based on honesty, and her fear of losing him if she had told him earlier. Mark's response was explosive. Witnesses in adjacent rooms later told investigators they heard raised voices starting shortly before 10 p.m. One guest described it as a man shouting in disbelief, as if his world had collapsed. Another recalled hearing a woman's voice pleading, her tone urgent but soft, like someone begging to be understood. For Mark, the revelation was more than a shock. It was a direct challenge to his identity, his values, and the image of the future he had constructed. His worldview, grounded in traditional notions of marriage and family, could not reconcile with what he had just learned. To him, this was not just a matter of personal history, it felt like a betrayal that mocked his trust. The argument intensified as the hours passed. Hotel surveillance showed no visitors to their room that night and no unusual activity in the hallway, confirming that the events were confined to the couple alone. Inside, Stephanie attempted to calm Mark, explaining that her transition had not changed the essence of who she was. She pleaded for him to see her as the same woman he had dated, loved, and married. But Mark's anger only grew, fueled by feelings of humiliation, confusion, and rage. By 11 p.m., the verbal fight escalated into physical confrontation. Neighbors later reported hearing a loud crash, possibly a lamp or a chair being knocked over. A thud followed, then silence, then another burst of shouting. At least one guest claimed to hear a woman cry out, followed by muffled sobs. Yet no one called hotel security at the time, assuming it was a personal dispute that would settle on its own. In that silence, the situation reached its breaking point. Investigators would later determine that Mark, consumed by anger, physically attacked Stephanie. Forensic evidence suggested she was struck multiple times before being strangled. The medical examiner's report confirmed blunt force trauma to the head and upper body, followed by asphyxiation as the cause of death. The time of death was estimated to be shortly after midnight, early on June 11, 2012. The aftermath of the violence left the hotel room in disarray. A shattered lamp lay on the floor, sheets were pulled from the bed, and Stephanie's camera was found broken near the dresser. Mark, in a state of shock, reportedly sat in the room for hours with his wife's body before leaving at dawn. Security footage later captured him exiting the hotel alone around 6:15 a.m., wearing the same clothes he had been seen in the previous evening. His expression was blank, his steps slow and deliberate. Stephanie's absence was noticed later that morning when housekeeping staff attempted to enter room 814 for cleaning. Finding the Do Not Disturb sign still hanging, they returned later, only to discover the body around noon when Mark had not returned and no response came from inside. The discovery immediately triggered a police response, setting into motion the investigation that would unravel the details of what had happened during that fateful night. The triggering incident, the disclosure of Stephanie's transgender history, became the central point of the case, sparking debates far beyond the crime itself. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the public wrestled with questions of honesty, identity, and the boundaries of personal truth in relationships. To some, Stephanie's decision to withhold her past was seen as understandable, even courageous, given the stigma she faced. To others, including Mark, it was framed as deception, fueling the anger that erupted into violence. Yet the stark reality remained. In the quiet of a Hawaiian hotel room, a confession intended to build trust instead destroyed a life. What should have been a honeymoon of new beginnings became, instead, the site of a homicide that shocked Hawaii's law enforcement community and rippled through national headlines. That single night, June 10th into June 11th, 2012, marked the collapse of everything the couple had built together. The paradise outside their window remained untouched, but inside room 814, the dream of love, marriage, and honesty had turned fatally dark. When the body of Stephanie Reynolds was discovered on the afternoon of June 11, 2012, the Honolulu Police Department immediately secured the 8th floor of the Royal Islander Hotel. It was around 12:15 p.m. when a housekeeper, entering room 814 with a master key after repeated unanswered knocks, found the room in disarray and the lifeless body of a woman lying near the bed. Shocked and trembling, she called hotel security, who then contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was clear Stephanie was beyond help. The scene told a grim story. Her body showed signs of blunt force trauma and strangulation. The once pristine honeymoon suite now resembled a crime scene. Overturned furniture, broken glass from a lamp, and bloodstains on the carpet. The contrast between the cheerful lace still sitting on the dresser and the violence in the room was striking. By 12:45 p.m., detectives and crime scene investigators began their work. Lead Detective Daniel Kawano, a veteran of the Honolulu Police Department, was assigned to the case. Kawano noted that nothing about the scene suggested a robbery. Stephanie's belongings, including her wallet, jewelry, and phone, were intact. The disorder appeared targeted, not random. To the experienced detective, the situation pointed immediately toward a crime of passion, most likely involving someone close to the victim. The first task was identifying the victim and locating her husband. Hotel staff confirmed that the couple had checked in together on June 9th and were registered as Mark and Stephanie Reynolds of Sacramento, California. Surveillance footage quickly showed the couple entering the hotel lobby together late on the evening of June 10th. Hours later, the same cameras captured Mark leaving the building alone at 6:15 a.m. on June 11th, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. He did not return. Detectives reached out to Honolulu International Airport, and by cross-checking passenger manifests, they discovered that Mark had boarded a morning flight to Los Angeles at 7:55 a.m., barely 2 hours before Stephanie's body was found. The decision to leave Hawaii without his wife raised immediate suspicions. Meanwhile, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on June 12th. The official cause of death was listed as homicide by strangulation, with secondary injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. Time of death was estimated between 11:30 p.m. on June 10th and 12:30 a.m. on June 11th. The report would later be crucial in piecing together the timeline. Investigators also combed through the couple's digital history. Stephanie's phone contained recent text drafts that revealed her inner turmoil. In one unsent message apparently meant for a close friend, she wrote, "I finally told him tonight. He's angry. I don't know what will happen. I just hope he still loves me." That single sentence gave detectives insight into the possible motive. Detective Kawano and his team began contacting friends and family of the couple back in California. Interviews painted a picture of a seemingly ordinary marriage but also highlighted underlying differences. Stephanie's friends described her as nervous leading up to the wedding, admitting privately that she had not told Mark about her past as a transgender woman. Some had urged her to be open before saying "I do," but she had delayed, believing love would be enough to bridge the truth. On Mark's side, colleagues and relatives described him as traditional, proud, and sometimes rigid in his views about relationships. His sudden decision to marry after only a year of dating had surprised some of his co-workers, though most saw it as evidence of him finally settling down. To those who knew him, violence seemed out of character. but none could explain why he had abandoned his wife's body and fled Hawaii. The investigation widened when Honolulu detectives coordinated with authorities in California. On June 13, 2012, Mark Reynolds was detained by Sacramento police at his parents' residence. He did not resist arrest but appeared visibly shaken and withdrawn. When questioned, he initially denied involvement, claiming that he had left the hotel early to clear his head after an argument and that Stephanie was alive when he departed. But inconsistencies in his timeline quickly unraveled his story. Surveillance evidence showed no signs of Stephanie leaving the hotel after his departure, and the autopsy placed her time of death well before dawn. Further, airline records proved that Mark had purchased his flight only a few hours before boarding, suggesting an impulsive attempt to flee. To investigators, this was a clear indicator of consciousness of guilt. The case was soon making headlines across Hawaii and California. Local news outlets reported on the Honeymoon homicide, and as details leaked about Stephanie's transgender identity, the story gained national attention. The narrative was sensational and tragic. A new bride killed in paradise, a husband fleeing the scene, and a hidden truth at the center of it all. Public opinion divided quickly. Some sympathized with Stephanie, emphasizing her right to privacy and safety. Others controversially debated the morality of her decision not to disclose her past sooner. Within days, prosecutors announced they would charge Mark Reynolds with second-degree murder, citing evidence of intentional violence rather than a spontaneous accident. The charge carried a potential sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole. For the prosecution, the case was about a man who, upon discovering something he could not accept, chose rage over compassion and violence over understanding. The early phase of the investigation set the framework for what would follow. A highly scrutinized trial, intense media coverage, and a deeper look into issues of identity, honesty, and violence within intimate relationships. But for the detectives who first stepped into room 814, the case was less about public debate and more about the cold reality of what had occurred. They had a victim whose honeymoon ended in tragedy. They had a suspect who had fled the island hours after her death. And they had a trail of evidence, physical, digital, and circumstantial, that painted a devastatingly clear picture of what had unfolded between June 10 and June 11, 2012. The investigation was far from over, but the direction was unmistakable. Mark Reynolds, once a husband celebrating love in Hawaii, was now the prime suspect in the murder of his wife. By the time Mark Reynolds was in custody in California in mid-June 2012, the case already seemed straightforward to many. A husband discovered his wife's secret, reacted violently, and tried to escape. But as the investigation deepened, new information came to light that complicated the narrative and introduced unexpected layers of motive, psychology, and evidence. The first twist came from Mark himself. During his second formal interrogation on June 15, 2012, he broke down and admitted to killing Stephanie, but the way he framed it shifted the conversation. According to his statement, he had not planned to harm her. He claimed he was blindsided by her confession about being transgender and that he had acted, in the heat of the moment, overcome with shock and anger. "I felt like my whole life was a lie," he reportedly told detectives. He insisted he never intended to kill her but admitted he lost control. This confession was both incriminating and strategic. By portraying the killing as a crime of passion rather than premeditation, Mark's defense team could argue for manslaughter instead of murder, reducing the potential sentence drastically. Prosecutors, however, were not convinced. The brutality of the attack, combined with his decision to flee Hawaii immediately after, suggested to them a level of intent beyond mere impulse. The second twist emerged from digital evidence. Investigators discovered that in the days leading up to the murder, Mark had searched online for terms like "what to do if your spouse lies about their past" and annulment laws in California. More damningly, his search history included queries about violence and criminal sentencing. These searches indicated he might have been considering extreme actions even before Stephanie's confession. The defense argued the searches were the product of anxiety and confusion, not intent, but to prosecutors, it painted a picture of a man already on edge contemplating desperate solutions. Meanwhile, Stephanie's past came under scrutiny in ways that highlighted both her courage and her vulnerability. Friends revealed that she had struggled for years with fear of rejection, even after her transition. She had lived openly as female but chose carefully who she confided in about her history. For her, love with Mark had represented a fresh start, a life where she was accepted fully as the woman she had become. But the diary entries and texts found on her phone showed the weight of secrecy pressing heavily on her shoulders. "I know he'll see me differently," she wrote in one entry just weeks before the wedding. "But if he loves me the way he says he does, maybe it won't matter." The third twist arose during forensic analysis. Police discovered traces of Stephanie's blood on Mark's watch and under his fingernails, consistent with violent struggle. But they also uncovered bruises on Mark's forearms that suggested defensive scratches, indicating Stephanie had fought back during the attack. This detail undermined Mark's portrayal of the incident as a single moment of losing control, instead showing a prolonged and violent confrontation. As these findings surfaced, the media frenzy intensified. The story was no longer just about a murder in Hawaii, it became a flashpoint in national debates about gender identity, disclosure, and the so-called trans panic defense, where defendants claimed extreme emotional reaction upon learning of a partner's transgender status. Civil rights groups condemned Mark's defense, arguing that no revelation could justify violence. Meanwhile, his legal team painted him as a man trapped in confusion and betrayal, someone who reacted badly but not with calculated intent. Another unexpected turn came from Mark's family. His parents publicly defended him, describing him as a good man who made a terrible mistake. They insisted he was not hateful but simply overwhelmed by information he could not process. On the other hand, Stephanie's family spoke passionately about her bravery and her right to safety, emphasizing that her history did not diminish her humanity. "She loved him," her sister said in a televised interview. "She trusted him with her heart, and he destroyed her for being honest." Perhaps the most dramatic mid-plot twist, however, was the revelation that Mark had reached out to a close friend via email just hours after the killing. Investigators retrieved the message sent at 4:12 a.m. Hawaii time in which Mark wrote, "I don't know what to do. She lied to me about everything. I lost it. She's gone. I'm leaving." This email not only placed him in the room at the time of the crime but also undermined his later claim that Stephanie was alive when he left the hotel. By the end of June 2012, the case had shifted from a simple husband kills wife narrative to a complex legal and social battle. The prosecution aimed to prove murder with intent, supported by evidence of violence, flight, and incriminating communications. The defense aimed to reduce culpability, framing the incident as a tragic outburst from a man overwhelmed by unexpected truth. The mid-plot of the story revealed a deeper truth. The killing of Stephanie Reynolds was not just about one night in Hawaii. It was about secrecy, identity, societal prejudice, and the dangerous intersections of love and fear. The twists, the confession, the digital evidence, the email, only deepened the tragedy, showing that this was not a random act of violence but the unraveling of a fragile relationship under the weight of unspoken truths. What had begun as a honeymoon in paradise had turned into a case that would soon test the courts, challenge cultural conversations, and leave two families shattered on opposite sides of justice. By the time Mark Reynolds was formally charged in early July 2012, the case had moved beyond the quiet corridors of the Honolulu Police Department and into the glare of the courtroom and national media. The initial investigation had revealed the brutality of the crime, but it was the trial preparations that brought the deepest conflicts to light. Conflicts not only between prosecution and defense, but also between cultural values, family loyalties, and public perceptions of gender identity. The prosecution, led by Deputy Prosecutor Linda Watanabe, built its case on the foundation of intent and violence. In her pretrial filings, Watanabe argued that Mark had not simply lost control in the heat of the moment but had allowed his anger and humiliation to escalate into deliberate homicide. The state pointed to the autopsy, which revealed prolonged struggle, and the email Mark sent at 4:12 a.m., effectively admitting to the killing. This was not an accident, Watanabe said during a preliminary hearing. This was rage turned into action. The defense, meanwhile, adopted a controversial strategy. Led by attorney Michael Barnes, they pursued what was known in legal circles as a form of the trans panic defense. Their argument rested on the claim that Mark had been psychologically overwhelmed by Stephanie's disclosure and that his violent response, while tragic, lacked the clear-minded intent required for a murder conviction. Barnes portrayed Mark as a man blindsided by deception, framing him not as a monster but as someone emotionally broken by a secret he was unprepared to handle. This strategy immediately ignited outrage. Advocacy groups across the country condemned it as victim-blaming, arguing that it reinforced dangerous stereotypes and excused violence against transgender individuals. Outside the courthouse in Honolulu, protesters held signs that read, "Honesty is not a crime, violence is, and justice for Stephanie." The case was no longer just about one couple. It had become a symbolic trial about gender identity, honesty, and the limits of legal defenses. Inside the courtroom, the conflict intensified with emotional testimony. Stephanie's friends and family took the stand, recounting her struggles with secrecy and her decision to trust Mark with the truth. Her sister wept as she told jurors about the last phone call she received before the honeymoon, in which Stephanie admitted she was nervous but hopeful. She wanted him to love her for who she was, her sister said. She didn't deserve to die for being honest. Mark's family testified as well, offering a starkly different perspective. His mother described him as a man with strong values and a sensitive heart, insisting that his actions were the result of shock, not hatred. His father argued that Stephanie's failure to disclose her past before the marriage had pushed Mark into a corner. These testimonies highlighted the deep divide not only between the families but also between broader societal views of the case. The climax of the conflict came when forensic experts presented the physical evidence. Photographs of the hotel room, Stephanie's injuries, and the autopsy findings left the jury visibly shaken. The prosecution emphasized that the pattern of injuries was consistent with sustained assault, not a single impulsive act. The defensive scratches on Mark's arms, shown in close-up photographs, reinforced the narrative that Stephanie had fought for her life. The state argued that this eliminated any possibility of the killing being instantaneous or accidental. It had taken time, enough for Mark to stop if he had wanted to. During cross-examination, the defense tried to minimize the significance of the struggle. Barnes asked the medical examiner whether panic or emotional breakdown could lead to uncontrollable violence. The expert acknowledged the possibility but maintained that the evidence suggested deliberate force. This clash of interpretations became the focal point of the trial. Was Mark's act the product of temporary insanity brought on by emotional shock, or was it a conscious choice to end his wife's life? Adding to the conflict, the prosecution introduced Mark's online search history from days before the honeymoon. Jurors saw printouts of queries about annulment, deception, and even criminal penalties. Watanabe argued this showed Mark had already been wrestling with doubts and possible extreme actions. The defense countered that these were curiosity searches, not evidence of intent. Yet to many in the courtroom, it suggested premeditation, or at least an unstable mindset brewing before Hawaii. As the trial continued, tensions escalated in the public arena as well. News outlets broadcast nightly coverage, framing the case as a cultural flashpoint. Talk shows debated whether Mark's feelings of betrayal excused his actions or whether such arguments were rooted in prejudice. Commentators noted that this was one of the rare high-profile cases where a transgender victim's identity was at the center of legal strategy, sparking wider conversations about equality and violence. The conflict reached its peak during closing arguments. Prosecutor Watanabe stood before the jury, holding a photograph of Stephanie smiling on her honeymoon just hours before her death. "This woman loved her husband," she said. "She chose to trust him with her truth, and his answer was to take her life. That is not passion. That is not panic. That is murder." Defense attorney Barnes countered with a plea for empathy, describing Mark as a man who snapped under unbearable pressure. He urged jurors to see the killing as a tragic outburst, not a calculated act. "He is guilty of a mistake," Barnes said, "but he is not guilty of murder." The courtroom was silent as both sides rested. The jury now carried the burden of deciding which narrative they believed. Outside, the world waited, families torn apart, activists demanding justice, and the broader public divided over what the verdict would mean not just for Mark Reynolds but for the wider conversation about truth, identity, and accountability. In this rising conflict, the honeymoon murder had transformed into something larger, a test of justice at the intersection of love, secrecy, and violence. The answer would soon come, but the tension in Honolulu was already at its breaking point. On August 3, 2012, after nearly 3 weeks of testimony, arguments, and deliberations, the jury in Honolulu returned with its verdict. The courtroom fell into tense silence as the foreperson stood and read the decision. guilty of second-degree murder. Mark Reynolds sat motionless, staring forward as the words echoed across the room. His parents wept quietly in the back row, while Stephanie's family clutched one another, tears of grief and relief flowing together. For them, the verdict was not a victory. It could never bring Stephanie back, but it was justice, a recognition that her life had value and that her death was not excusable under the veil of panic or betrayal. Judge Maria Tanaka later sentenced Mark to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, the maximum allowed under Hawaii's statute for second-degree murder. In her remarks, Judge Tanaka acknowledged the complexity of emotions in the case but made it clear that violence could never be justified by personal shock. "Marriage is built on trust," she said. "When that trust is broken, the answer is not violence. The answer is dialogue, compassion, or even separation. But never death." Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. Advocates for transgender rights called the verdict a landmark moment, underscoring that the so-called panic defense would not stand in Hawaii. National media outlets covered the sentencing extensively, framing it as both a tragic crime and a cultural milestone in how courts viewed violence against transgender individuals. For many, Stephanie became a symbol, a woman who deserved to live her truth without fear, and whose death sparked important conversations about honesty, identity, and safety. In Sacramento, friends organized a memorial exhibition of Stephanie's photography, displaying the images she had captured in Hawaii before her death. Sunset shots, candid portraits, and bright scenes of island life filled the gallery walls. Attendees remembered her not as a victim but as an artist, a sister, and a woman who loved deeply. One of her closest friends wrote in the program, "She carried a secret for too long, but in the end, her truth was an act of courage." Mark began serving his sentence at Halawa Correctional Facility on Oahu before being transferred to a California prison under an interstate compact agreement. Reports described him as quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time in isolation. His parents continued to visit, insisting he was remorseful but misunderstood. Stephanie's family, meanwhile, channeled their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about the importance of protecting transgender individuals from violence and the dangers of stigma. Though the case officially closed with the sentencing, its echoes lingered in legal circles and social debates. Law schools studied the trial as an example of the challenges posed by identity-based defenses. Advocacy groups cited it when pushing for legislation to ban panic defenses nationwide. And for those who had known Stephanie personally, the memory of her kindness, her art, and her bravery became a legacy stronger than the crime that took her life. What had begun as a joyful honeymoon in Hawaii ended in tragedy, but the courtroom's verdict ensured that the narrative did not belong solely to the man who ended her life. Instead, it also belonged to Stephanie Reynolds, a woman who dared to live authentically, even when honesty cost her everything.